CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. To learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples.
Hi everybody, my name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. We're gathered here on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I'd like to pay my respect to all elders, past and present, and also to acknowledge all First Nations people here today. So today it's my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ursula K. Frederick. Ursula is a creative practice researcher, archaeologist, and senior research fellow with us in the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research. Ursula is CI, Chief Investigator, on the ARC-funded Archives in Bark project, which is a study of culturally modified boab trees in the Kimberley. One of Ursula's key research interests concerns how people, past and present, express their relationships to identity, culture, place and time through inscription and mark-making practices, including rock art, carved trees, and, as you'll hear today, graffiti. Ursula regularly exhibits her own artwork, and she actually has an exhibition coming up shortly at the hugely prestigious Drill Hall Gallery at the ANU. This is going to be very special. It's called Unseeded, with an S. And the launch is on the 26th of September, which I think is a Thursday night at 6 p.m. And that's a public event. So you're all welcome to come along to that. We'll put out more communications through the Research Centre as it comes up. In the meantime, please join me in welcoming us.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming in today on such a beautiful spring day and with all the exciting news we've had about the Vice-Chancellor. So I appreciate you taking time out to be here amongst us. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to their traditional owners, past, present, and future. I want to extend that respect to other First Nations groups and individuals with us online and in the room. I also want to acknowledge that there are other Australian, North American First Nations peoples whose country will feature in the slides today, particularly the country of the Gumbaynyin Nation. I also want to draw attention to the fact that my presentation makes reference to individuals who've passed away, including children and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and also animals. Today, I'll be presenting an overview of my work and thinking on graffiti and informal inscription practices, as well as point to some of the research that I hope to do in the near future. Because graffiti can be a controversial subject, I want to start by offering a language warning. Note that there may be some reference to challenging issues, and to be clear that the views expressed in the graffiti I show today are not necessarily my own. Having said that, I think that one of the compelling aspects of graffiti is that due to its diversity of expression, it can offer up a message or sentiment with which we may feel a shared opinion, even if we dislike the action in its own right. In other words, we can love and hate it at the same time. With all that is going on in the world and the many significant and distressing issues that we are confronted with in the news, some of you may have missed last week's announcement from the New South Wales Police about the establishment of their new strike force, Opalika. It seems someone has been targeting luxury vehicles and spray painting their badges. And this was not your average keying incident. It turns out that more than 80 Beamers, Mercs, Porsches, and other premium motor cars had been subjected to a new paint job. I mention this intriguing case of vandalism today, not because I feel that it's a first world problem in need of discussion, but because it's a prime example of how contemporary graffiti is articulated and disseminated through media channels. I don't think there were any Teslas. Another recent example from the international stage that may or may not have caught your attention is the emergence of several new animal-themed graffiti popping up around London. These stencils, in contrast to the car's embellishments, were referred to as murals by the press and were quickly attributed to and claimed by Banksy, who is of course now a household name. Considered together, these two incidents share some common features: the spray paint, the damage or enhancement to property, depending on how you view it, and perhaps most notably, the mystery surrounding their intent and their meaning. However, clearly their public reception and media reportage is sharply different. This illustrates a fascinating tension at the heart of contemporary graffiti practice, whereby one unauthorized inscription may be regarded as vandalism and the other regarded as art. Now, we might offer any number of reasons for why these two recent graffiti incidents are perceived differently: where it occurred, who did it, the scale, the frequency, the labor or difficulty involved in achieving the outcome, the motivation, the message, the wit or playfulness, the aesthetics, the skill of execution, who the piece is directed at, and so on. Nonetheless, they appear to have been understood and treated as different kinds of inscription activity and behavior. And in this conundrum, if we can call it that, maybe evidenced in contemporary graffiti scholarship more generally, which tends to be divided along two lines, which I refer to as the creative and the criminal. This bifurcation is reflected in the growing usage of specific terms like street art and mural, and is often deployed as a way of distinguishing the graffiti we like from the graffiti that we don't. This leads us to the challenge of discerning what makes something graffiti in the first place. Now, there are numerous, of course, definitions we might take up, but as a starting point, I refer to the work of human geographer Tim Creswell and a concept of graffiti that he has articulated as matter which is out of place. Drawing on anthropologist Mary Douglas's work on pollution and cleanliness, Creswell proposes that the impression of dirtiness and disorder that becomes attached to graffiti actions is based on its presence, occurring somewhere that it doesn't belong. In other words, graffiti becomes an act of disobedience when it is made in a place where it isn't expected or authorized to occur. I've argued in my own research previously that we may extend this spatial conceptualization of graffiti as matter out of place to incorporate temporality and to suggest that graffiti can also be matter out of time. A good illustration of what I mean by this is demonstrated at El Morro National Monument in New Mexico in the United States. Over time, this impressive sandstone bluff has attracted thousands of inscriptions and carvings, which include the petroglyphs of ancestral Puebloans, as well as inscriptions of Spanish conquistadors, military personnel, government officials, missionaries, pioneers, and travelers. The Monument and National Park Service today recognize these inscriptions as integral to the heritage values of this place. However, all graffiti made after 1906, when the park was officially registered and designated a national monument, were considered to be illegal and subsequently removed. This is an example of what I mean when I say graffiti being defined as matter out of time, because inscriptions post-dating 1906 are not sufficiently old and therefore unwanted. In other words, it is not only where graffiti occurs, but the when that contributes to attributions of value and meaning. So how do we establish when is and when isn't the right amount of time for something to belong? In an Australian context, one might argue that some of the first graffiti made on this continent may still be found in the material ruins of colonization that occupy our museums. The Dirk Hartog and de Vlaming plates, for example, were inscribed by early Dutch explorers and left at an island known as Wirramana by the Malgana traditional owners of what we now call Shark Bay. Can we say that these text objects as unauthorized proclamations of discovery on unceded country may be comparable to other climes of graffiti. I recognize that this is probably a little bit thorny turf to be entering, but in using this example, I propose that graffiti as matter out of place and out of time needs to consider both graffiti's production and its reception. It's contingent on a context that is dynamic. The case of El Morro's selective and simultaneous celebration and erasure of separate graffiti incidents demonstrates how the artifacts and actions of graffiti can operate alongside and against each other. It also highlights the reiterative and dialogical capacities of graffiti, how the trace of prior graffiti activity can compel more to be made in the present and future. Now, when in 2023, Ivan was caught making his mark at the Colosseum and videoed doing so by another tourist, there was a sense of collective online outrage. Yet his actions could also be read as resonating with a longer history and tradition of tourist behaviors in Europe. As archaeologists remind us, this is the sort of thing that people do and have always done. And it is also why we are now able to visit sites of the ancient world and see the tags of people from previous centuries, like that of Lord Byron. Hence, archaeological research elucidates that graffiti has a deeper history, and so does its scholarship. Classical archaeologists in particular have conducted a considerable amount of research on mark-making practices across the ancient world, where numerous examples of textual and pictorial graffiti reveals details about the culture, daily life, and politics of the time in which it was made. From Pompeii and Herculaneum alone, thousands of graffiti have been found and recorded. Much of this research is grounded in the field of epigraphy, which positions graffiti as a text that can be read, classified, and interpreted. As such, it tends to characterize graffiti as a mode of writing that may be evaluated along other past acts of inscription, often in comparison to monumental writing in the form of state-sponsored inscriptions and commemorative architecture. Whereas the latter contribute to an understanding of official and authorized narratives, graffiti provide insight into the voices of everyday citizens, as well as marginalized individuals and groups. This history of research from as early as the 1880s reveals that graffiti across the ancient world were made by men, women, and children, free and unfree, in public and private spaces, and that it was a very commonplace activity. As well as highlighting the everyday aspects of graffiti in particular social and cultural settings, archaeological research has also revealed that informal inscriptions played a role in commemorative gestures and signaling important occasions, such as through journeys of pilgrimage. In the UK, for example, there are numerous examples of graffiti as a commemorative or devotional gesture. When I first visited Canterbury Cathedral, I was really blown away by the number of graffiti everywhere, like on the tombs, on the pillars, on the seats. It was, yeah, amazing. But we also know that other mediums of annotation, such as marginalia, which is sometimes likened to graffiti, were also an active practice of Christian devotion. But to be clear, religiously inspired mark-making traditions are not specific to Christianity. Another example is the historical and contemporary practice of gouging. Aside from sacred spaces, a key focus in archaeology and heritage studies of historical graffiti centers around places of incarceration and confinement, such as jails, prisoners of war and internment camps, and even quarantine stations. Such archaeological approaches tend to treat each graffito as an artifact, as a form of data which might be considered individually as a source of information, but which might also be analyzed alongside other graffiti or patterns. Changes in technique, form, content, size, and other material attributes may give an indication of changing function, motivation, and meaning over time. The spatial distribution of graffiti is also regarded as an important factor. For example, in determining what is hidden and visible, such as the door of a prison cell obscured from the view of the prison guard. At the same time, specific graffiti are often examined in detail to form object biographies. In summary, graffiti from the past tends to be valued as heritage, and research into past informal mark-making activity can deepen our understanding of ancient and modern societies. But archaeological approaches may also inform and complicate our understanding of graffiti in the present. My own research has incorporated historical and contemporary mark-making practices and is set within a broader trajectory that involves the study of art practice, art history, and Indigenous rock art. Some of my projects have addressed the archaeology of graffiti as counter-narrative in histories of immigration, whereas other work is methodologically driven or interdisciplinary. And as an archaeologist who works on the contemporary past, I'm especially interested in examining material cultures and practices of 21st century lifeways. And in this vein, going forward, I hope to investigate a broader range of inscription practices, material accumulations, and site interventions that I refer to under the banner of expanded graffiti. With this term, I seek to unfold a variety of contemporary happenings, from lovelock attachments and abject alleyways of bubblegum to the hanging sneaker phenomenon. And in doing so, I aim to explore questions around value. I'll quickly go through some of these on screen just to give a sense of the diversity that we can find in unsolicited inscriptions. Now, I'm not making value judgments about what is appropriate and what isn't. I'm presenting examples that hopefully will help people to think about how inscription practices are attributed value. More specifically, I hope to investigate how such practices of expanded graffiti play out in natural environments and in heritage contexts. The presence of things that don't belong in designated cultural heritage places and landscapes is a fairly unexplored aspect of mark-making activity. You may not be able to see it very clearly, but thanks to Paul, I was reminded of this feature here, Maori Man. However, it's an increasingly important issue, particularly in the context of heritage management. And in the future, I hope to be working with Parks Australia and the Anangu community at Uluru Kata National Park to explore some of the unusual and unauthorized behaviors that they are experiencing there currently. But I now want to shift gears. And in the next part of the talk, I want to look more closely at a specific place where I have undertaken a detailed investigation of contemporary inscription practice. And that is a place called Nambucca Heads. Nambucca Heads is a coastal town in northern New South Wales. It's about 5 hours from Sydney and 4.5 south of Brizzy. The feature I want to focus on in this environment is the local breakwater, known colloquially as the V-Wall. Many locals visit the V-Wall for daily walks, sometimes both in the morning and the late afternoon. But as a coastal community, Nambucca Heads also has a number of holiday homes and experiences a transitory influx of visitors throughout the year, particularly during school holidays and summer. Breakwalls are a familiar sight along the New South Wales coast and vary in size and shape. The materials from which they are composed commonly include rubble, quarried rocks, dredged sediment, and concrete blocks. In many coastal towns, these breakwaters have been integrated with parks and recreation facilities and have become popular places for leisure activity. They're structures that are intended to protect harbour and coastal towns from rough seas, but they also act to contain and reclaim and preserve land, particularly in the increasingly extreme weather events of the Anthropocene. Australian archaeologist Dennis Byrne has written of the geometric edge or striation that such structures impose upon the coastline as an archaeological signature of humanity's totalizing claim over planetary space. That's a quote. The V-Wall was originally constructed as a seawall in the early 20th century and is a good example of such monumental mark-making, as we can see in this photograph from the 1930s. Over time, it has been subject to adjustment and substantial transformation to prevent erosion and to better accommodate the islands and sandbars and tidal flows of the Nambucca River. As with other coastal towns along the Pacific Ocean, the V-Wall has been developed into a foreshore recreation area and is an increasingly vibrant and popular place for locals and tourists. In the last 10 years or so, it has become known more widely for the colorful painted rocks there, which go some way towards softening that harsh geometry. Beyond its physical construction, I have been unable to uncover any definitive origin story of how the V-wall came to be a place to visit and paint and see. Although the local history museum does have some photographs documenting paintings as far back as the 1960s and 70s, there's no clear account of how and when the practice of painting the seawall emerged. For me, this is actually an endearing aspect of the V-wall's history, because although it has become a tourist destination in recent years, it was not intentionally developed as a community or participatory project, a public and art initiative, or a commercially driven tourist venture. It appears to have grown organically as a place remade through the practice and accumulation of graffiti. Many of the paintings evident at Nambucca reflect a strong sense of seasonality and intermittent visitation. Many can be seen to mark arrival and departure at a destination and enfold a cyclic sentiment in which the tradition and promise of return is celebrated. Past visits are recalled, and in so doing, future visits anticipated. Over time, the seasonal patterning has led some people to acquire a sense of belonging or custodial responsibility and even ownership over a rock, and is particularly visible in the form of what we might call family rocks, which often include a surname or some other declaration like the Thompsons since 2008. Of course, such statements of intergenerational tradition might pale in comparison to straightforward pronouncements of deep time belonging that you also find at Nambucca, such as Kamilaroi and other First Nations identifications. I still think these family rocks provide us an insight into the acts of community bonding and social cohesion that takes place there. While many of the rock paintings there are allusions to travel and mobilities with representations of cars, caravans, roads featuring strongly, journeying to Nambucca more specifically is also rendered, whether through an iconography of routes and maps or as traveling from A to B. The phrases or messaging incorporated within the overall assemblage tend to convey an affirmative or aspirational quality. Rainbows, peace signs. We're not far from Byron, I guess. Love hearts, quite common. And together they express through popular sentiment around love, togetherness, such as forever and always, love you to the moon and back, that kind of thing. But there are also general declarations of positivity and well-being that might be called words of wisdom that are addressed to the passing public. Slow down, kick back. That'll be nice, won't it? By way of contrast, I have observed very minimal in the way of political messages or obscene language, though there are oblique references to drug use and, of course, the ever ubiquitous penis graffiti, which is not shown here. Nonetheless, the predominantly positive tone and content of the inscriptions and the environment's natural beauty make the V-wall an inviting place. In settings such as this, standing on the edge of the shore, feeling the elements, we can become acutely attuned to the subtle yet enduring rhythms of existence. The tidal flows, the diurnal movements from day to night as the sun rises and sets, watching the whales migrate north or south. There is simultaneously also a feeling of timelessness that we can see and sense, for example, through the repetition of the waves. Many of the V-wall paintings appear to respond to the beauty of this setting and seek to evoke it. Time and its passage is also a prominent feature of the inscriptions, both in the form of dates and lifespans, and in the gradual disintegration of the applied materials, surface erosion, and growth of algae. Here, the mark-making process involves a tactile engagement with the wall, a strongly sensorial activity in which one's body is exposed to the forces of nature and elements of place, the sun and the spray of the sea, the wind in the afternoon, all the while trying to maintain balance and control the movement of paint across a roughened surface. An assurance of universal rhythms and daily routines set by the human and more than human patterns of life is acutely present at Nambucca. Dolphins swim up the channel in the morning. Black cockatoos return to roost in the cliffs at night. There are also familiar faces you see every day on your walk. These are beguiling cues to the cycles of life and of tomorrow yet to come. And this heightened awareness may go some way towards explaining why the V-wall has become a place for contemplating and celebrating the presence and passage of life, and has been remade as a place for remembrance. Because as well as commemorating family visits and celebratory occasions like honeymoons, the inscription practice here has generated a growing number of personal memorials. The informal enactment of memorial activity at the V-Wall is not, I would suggest, the same as at some places where the presence of so-called improvised or spontaneous memorials occur, and where they're often implicated in difficult histories and dark heritage. A difference may be attributed to the holiday atmosphere, or it may simply be the fact that the memorials are part of one vast accumulation of entangled messages and sentiments. Some of the memorials here are born from a relationship between individuals and their experience of Nambucca Heads. They may have lived there, they may have died there, or they may have had some other association to the area. So in some cases, the memorials at the V-Wall are very much place dependent. For example, it took almost 2 decades for Garvin Sunderland's now elderly father to travel there from the UK and leave his memorial. But by preparing the rock in advance and with the assistance of a friend, he was eventually able to do so. For others, however, the link to Nambucca Heads is more obtuse. The scenic beauty, idyllic beaches, wildlife, and laid back away from home status offer up lines of nostalgic connection to other times and places. There are numerous and varied memorials at the V-Wall, predominantly for people, but also for pets. In fact, over the course of my research, I've observed a notable increase in this activity. They occur all along the V-Wall, although some will say there is a concentration at one end, near the opening to the river. Although their makers have all chosen a public space to memorialize their loved ones, some people have elected to place their memorials away from other painted rocks, or have them facing out to sea, rather than the pathway where they are more visible. Placement may reflect a desire or need for accessibility, as in the case of Garvin's rock, or it may reveal a desire for prominence. Others appear to ask for privacy. The location of a memorial might be very particular in its association, as in the case of the rock where Wiggles used to sit on daily walks. Or it may be a place where someone likes to imagine her well-loved fisherman brother. In this way, particular points along the V-Wall may become important sites of visitation, and individual rocks have become invested with meaning as a result of the memorial inscribed there. Over time, certain rocks become strongly linked to an individual or group, and they may encompass different habits of what we might call ritual. Some of the memorials suggest a spur of the moment or iterative response inspired by the setting. As we know, graffiti elicits more graffiti. Some of these inscriptions indicate minimal preparation, whereas others reveal a deeper investment of time, materials, and labor. A small number have been commissioned and are revered by the local community for their artistry. And along with distribution and media, there are other factors we might consider in undertaking an archaeology of this place, such as content, iconography, how they are made, by whom, and so forth. Putting aside the fact that they are made in public space and therefore subject to the whims of local government and the general populace, they are also subject to the conditions of the coastal environment in which they are emplaced. And this challenges any preconceived notion of memorials as necessarily permanent. The tides, the sun, and the wind transform often quickly, and to make a memorial here is to either ignore or to accept that it will not last without regular renewal and oversight. Some people choose to accept this fragile and ephemeral quality, and perhaps for them it's more in the making that the meaning is found. For others, a more enduring commemoration is sought after, and a commitment to maintain and renew the memorial is integral to its production. I now want to turn briefly to a memorial made for the future by Stella and her family, who visited Nambucca Heads in 2020 and spoke to me about their inscription. In Stella's words, this is sort of like a memorial rock for the future. Stella's words, "My former husband died 4 years ago, and my son had nowhere to go and be able to be at peace with him and talk to him. So because it was my birthday, I thought, if we did a rock now with all of our names on it, when we finally leave this earth, Ryan and Maya, her children, will have somewhere to come, and it will be our special place. It's a memorial in one, and a family rock." In preparation for the occasion, Stella sought advice. I looked it up, she said. I asked my phone. I asked the lady in the phone, which she obviously means Siri, I think, unless it's Princess Leia or something more exciting. How do I paint a rock at Nambucca Heads? And all these things came up. And when describing her choices, Stella said, well, I knew that a lot of colors didn't show up. I was going to use white, but then we really only used the red and the black. And I just really wanted our names on there and the love heart for our love and the November 2020, because that was when we did it. So it was always going to be simple. And in terms of placement, all of the family chime in. I love this rock. And Estella especially says, I like this spot too, because it's where the ocean comes in. And you can see this rock when you come along. And also, it's very hard to find a flat rock, and you can actually see it really well. There are many memorial rocks now, she says, and little plaques. I just think it's wonderful. Stella identifies the rock they have painted as a kind of future memorial, which she emphasizes needs to be maintained. Her insistence that her children care for the rock once she is gone is in effect an effort to initiate a family ritual that will involve a pilgrimage to return and reflect and a commitment to its maintenance. Maya, Stella's adult daughter, that's Ryan, appears to understand the rock's importance. I would imagine Mum would be coming and checking quite regularly that this rock is being upheld and there is no graffiti on it. But as Stella's husband, Daryl, immediately follows, you don't see a lot of vandalism around here. And Stella agrees, no, you don't. You see very little vandalism, which is another reason why we like it here. Maya's reference to graffiti draws out an intriguing distinction between what is perceived here as acceptable inscription practice and what is not, and reveals an underlying tension and uncertainty around this kind of mark making in public space. Over the years, I have observed one memorial rock in particular, which has become involved in something of a dispute over who has the rights and respects to paint there. The rock is prominently located near the path and is unusually upright, and thus mirrors more conventional memorial architecture in the sense that it's like an obelisk or a headstone. It also has a large flat surface, which presents an ideal canvas, and particularly when it's painted white. The maker of this inscription had assumed that people would make the effort to interpret its motivation, a memorial to two young brothers, and that they would respect, if you like, a shared sentiment that it should not be desecrated by anyone. Yet they have chosen to paint the rock background in a high white paint, a pigment which invites additions, if ever there was one. This is not only because it stands out in the glaring sunlight, but because any pebble of nearby sandstone could be used to make a mark against it. Although white may have been chosen for its symbolism, this shows in some senses a naivety about the choice of materials if the memorial is expected to survive. The memorial function of the V-wall is just one motivating factor behind its many inscriptions. The V-wall is no longer perceived merely as a barrier holding back the sea, protecting the town from the forces and encroachment of nature. Instead, it invites a closer engagement with its surfaces and the environment within which it is set. To return to Burns' analogy, it has been transformed. From a hard-line striation on the coast, it no longer clearly demarcates, but instead blends the sea and the land in a vast stroke of paint. Earlier in my talk, I spoke of a division in contemporary graffiti studies around the creative and the criminal. The V-wall provides an example of how these categories can intersect. Not everyone likes the inscription activity here. One local referred to it as littering, and some fisher people find that the painted surfaces become slippery and make climbing on the rocks more dangerous. The local authorities are yet to fine anyone for this unsolicited mark making, but nor do they police it. What they have expressed, however, is a desire to contain it and to ensure that the place remains safe and family friendly. This represents a transformation not only in the meaning of the V-wall, but in the perception of graffiti in this specific context, where it appears to have gone from being illegal and antisocial to a way of fostering a sense of community. If graffiti is accepted into place and effectively remakes it in this manner, can we still call it graffiti? That's it, thanks.
Thanks so much, Ursula. That was riveting. Anyone with any questions or comments they'd like to make? I'll ask you a quick one. Just round about the start, when you were challenging some of our assumptions about what is graffiti and what is not graffiti, I was starting to think about tattoos. Is there a way in which, I was thinking from the marginalia on books about tattoos?
Yes, that has been mentioned to me before. I guess there is, I guess the idea that someone might tattoo your body is a different experience to choosing to have your own body tattooed. And
Well,
I guess,
when it's a 16-year-old version of yourself.
yes, yes,
pretty
well, that too. You got something to tell us, Paul. So I guess the body, whether it's the public body that people feel they have some kind of ownership, whether it's their car, this kind of question of consent, I think, comes in. And for me, tattoos are really you're making that decision. And yes, you might regret it later. But the other thing about graffiti, I think it does have a sort of sense of not everlasting, whereas of course tattoos don't now either, but they did at one time. And so there's a kind of that act of permanence as a statement or claim of some kind, I think is different to how one might expect one's mark left out in the world to be received and understood and treated in terms of longevity. I have noticed this, I mean, call me old school, but this weird like scribble tradition going on with people's arms, and that's the latest tattoo thing to, do. Sorry, I have friends. No judgment really, but it's an interesting thing in that it does have more of an informal quality to it as a mark than, a big sort of, I don't know, portrait of Bill Shorten, for example. Yeah, so hope that answers the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ursula, really fantastic. And I love this concept of expanded graffiti. And I think that the temporality aspects that you talk to are really exciting and interesting. You know that I'm interested in this, so this won't come as a surprise to you, but I'm interested in the slide that you popped up around the rock stacking and the sticks. And it seems to me that is quite distinct in terms of the other examples that have popped up. And I wonder what that kind of creative criminal intersection is there, or I don't know I mean, if you think of those in the same ways, if there's an intersection in those. Anyway, I'm just interested in your broader thoughts.
Well, I think it probably, for me, most of all speaks to both a sense of both intent, but also perhaps a sense of lack of awareness of the implications of certain inscription work. And I think this is why it's quite important that this is now starting to become more talked about, because some people might not know that gathering all those sticks is, they don't necessarily think through that that's a change, the habitat of things is you're disrupting. And so I think there are links in terms of things like disruption. And, sometimes disruption can be a good thing. But so I think for me, there is definitely a different character to it. I'm not quite sure what that is yet, but I think it probably lies in this lack of awareness and intent. Whereas, for example, I don't know whether you've heard of this creepy things Instagram, where this person intentionally made marks in national parks, like drawings of things in on rocks, prominent rocks in national parks in the US, and like was confronted by people on her Instagram and stuff saying, what are you doing? This is against the law and it's really bad. And she sort of seems to have responded kind of like, yeah, I'm a bad person. So there are situations where people will do, even, maybe it's to get attention. I don't know what really that particular example. I haven't gone down that rabbit hole. But you know, it's kind of different to go to a national park and find something like that to finding, you know, a bag of rice that's left as a votive offering. Or perhaps it's not, because from the context of the people who are entrusted to care for that park, whether they be traditional owners or park managers or, you know, just daily users who have care for it, that is potentially the same thing. So I guess that's the kind of complication that I'm interested in exploring to see where it might take me. Thank you.
Nicholas Hall. Ursula, I'm interested in going back to the expanded graffiti term. And obviously, I think you're coming at it from that question of graffiti studies, if you like, and moving that on. But why have you chosen that angle rather than materiality itself and mark making more broadly and tried to expand that definition? Is there a need in the space to sort of move the graffiti discussion out, or why aren't we starting somewhere else? I'm just interested in that term, and you know, as to whether there's another
right.
term that works in this space and why you've chosen that one. And then I have another question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I do see it as an umbrella term, and there are, you know, as we know, these other site intervention and other kinds of ways of framing it potentially. But I guess I'm in putting that out there, I'm trying to establish a conceptual relationship that might encourage us to think about, is there a relationship? Is this, like you're saying, is it the right term? Is it the right association to be making? Well, maybe it's not. But, and I guess for me, it really came out of the Lovelocks movement and how, you know, at one point that was incredibly trendy. You know, it's what you did, you know, to express your love. And, you know, you went down to, you know, Wollongong, for example.
The Caribbean.
And yeah. I didn't include the photos, but yes. And then, you know, and Paris and all these other places around the world. But then at some point, it shifted and people started to protest effectively. And in Paris, there were signs up saying no Lovelocks, and there was an organization. And so I guess those examples led me to think, oh, right, this behavior is not acceptable for some people. And why is that? And so for me, because of my background, I guess, in looking at or interest in graffiti, I sort of saw there was a potential line of thinking that, you know, could have theory and you know, other comparative work to draw on. Although, as we've discussed, you know, there's not necessarily in the sense of national parks so much around the world. I mean, I think maybe in the case of Stonehenge, there might be some interesting potential there, and other really iconic places. But I'm open to changing terms or anything, you know, and also I guess I recognize that it's loaded. It's a loaded term, but I guess if you unpack that term, you can also see, well, it's you know, especially when you look at the history that we have that shows actually just around the corner from my house in Scullin, there is this house where people have let their kids go wild on their, you know, there's drawings all over the front of the house. And I'm just like, wow, you know, but that just reaffirms the kinds of histories that we have that show, you know, people were doing this. They decorated their own mantelpieces with scrolls and things. And so I guess it's also trying to, at the same time, unpack the contemporary judgment call over graffiti that a lot of, you know, classical archaeologists will really react to, because it doesn't reflect necessarily that that acceptance and ubiquity.
Hi, Ursula. Julia's my name. Lots of thought-provoking stuff in your talk today. Thank you. One of the things that it made me think about was how you consider dendroglyphs and things like that in terms of mark making. And I think also a lot about connection to country and displacement and disconnection. A lot of this speaks to me of lack of connection to country, but a desperate clawing attempt to somehow connect with something meaningful for people through relationship, and I suppose somehow to landscape. But it's kind of crazy that what they're doing feels to me totally disconnected to landscape, you know. And when I think about things like dendroglyphs and the sort of like spiritual connection involved with the maker of something like that, and their total connection to country and spirituality and massive time spans, enduring sort of understanding of themselves in place, you know. I don't know, I just feel completely depressed by the West. You know.
Well, two things there you're asking me, I guess. One, and apologies for those of you who came to see carved trees. I'm sorry, that'll have to be next year. We are progressing that project. It's doing great work. We've got a number of papers we've done, but the public presentation of that material, for obvious reasons, sometimes associated with really important places, still needs to be negotiated. And, you know, we've done some great 3D photogrammetry of boab trees that have been carved prior to European invasion, but also some that have been inscribed post. And I think there's a picture that I had in one of my slides. So that brings me to the fact that, well, dendroglyphs are produced across various cultures at various points in time, including contemporary tourist activities. You know, you see that a lot in the Kimberley on boab trees, for example. You see it on banyan trees. So it's not a thing that's stopped or stuck or static in time, that practice. However, there's also carvings in trees which reflect a more recent period of inscription, but which are done by Indigenous people. And those dendroglyphs might be a name, for example, or it might be you know, a footprint, an emu footprint. These, I'm giving you examples that I've observed. So I guess from my perspective, it's also important to acknowledge that there may be disconnections and disjunctures, but there are also continuums that are happening, and that we have to be kind of mindful that what we might think looks like graffiti might also be an extension of attachment and connection and activating connection to country. I have read papers where people have talked about contemporary graffiti in the context of community, Indigenous community. And I have seen, you know, initials that belong to someone that belongs to that place. So it's a very, you know, complex situation. Dendroglyphs were also made in different situations by people who they may look amazing and they might be beautiful, but they may not. They may be visitors or strangers to that land in the deeper time sense. And so I think kind of attributing it to one form or expression of mark making, such as a tree, is difficult. And in fact, in the northwest of Western Australia, boab trees were also carved extensively by stock men. Let's be honest about it.
Stockers.
Well, there are maybe a few stock women. I think there were actually, but it's not my field of research, so I don't know enough. But, you know, Darryl Lewis has done a lot of work on that, and how there is, you know, these trees become landmarks that invite gathering, and that is an extension of the gathering that occurred there. in the past and is ongoing. You know, there's a lot of Indigenous stockmen who carved as well. And so I don't know what the second point was. I might have lost it. Sorry. But thank you. Thank you for the comment.
Thanks, Ursula. I really, really enjoyed your talk. It was so interesting. And so I just had a question, and I might have missed this. And also maybe this is not being an archaeologist. Maybe there's a clear answer for this. But I suppose I was interested in graffiti and I suppose the performative aspects of it. And just from, I guess, my acquaintance with more of the kind of suburban ratbag teenage version of graffiti, where, you know, there's athleticism to it, right, as a practice. And there's a lot of it that is about a demonstration of that kind of athleticism. And maybe not that much regard for the final sort of material output. Is that something that, I mean, do you think that there are different practices that are more oriented towards that performative aspect, or is there a kind of relationship between I don't know, certain forms where it's kind of a mark making that, I don't even have the words to explain it, but yeah, I guess I'm just interested in that distinction between when people are leaving those marks as a kind of evidence of an embodied performance rather than with the intent for that to be a lasting, enduring aspect of material culture.
Yeah, thank you, Denise. I do think, well, I think performance plays a part in a lot of different examples across time. And that can be, like, as we see, a performance of protest. It doesn't, you know, you don't have to be necessarily a teenager trying to get it as high as you can, for example. But I do think that the rise of the internet and Instagram and TikTok and all these things has probably because that's also a way of documenting that, of course, you know, the books that graphers used to keep and probably still do are no longer that evidentiary sort of collection of what they did, and it was dependent on, you know, who saw it. And whereas now, of course, you can just, you know, prove it to anyone by just, you know, tweeting your latest, you know, tag. So there's a complexity there that actually, you know, graffiti studies people who are interested particularly in that have explored in much more depth than me. Lachlan McDowell, for example, in Melbourne. But I do think performance and the lack of, or the consciousness, not the lack of consciousness, the consciousness that it may not last is really kind of almost fundamental, I think, to a lot of graffiti practice. So the performance of it, whether that be secretive or whether it be showy, I do think is really important. And even in the case of, as I say, the memorial, that performance of making those memorials, in many instances, the ritual of maintaining those memorials, there's different aspects of performativity there that I think, but also that embodied relationship to the rocks. And I mean, you know, and decisions about where to paint and where not to paint, and are obviously a little bit different to, like, there's the highest thing, that's where I want to go, you know. So yeah, anyway.
My name is Gonzalo. My question is about the relationship between graffiti and criminality and vandalism in general. I feel like a lot of graffiti writers would take issue with being lumped in with wider street art or mark making practices. So have you given any thought as to that vandalism and that defacing of public property as a prerequisite for graffiti?
So, sorry, I'm not sure if I understand correctly. Are you saying that people who are street artists don't want to be lumped in, or the other way around?
So I'm from Madrid in Spain. And to give you an example, every year there's this street art festival where they paint a bunch of storefronts. Those storefronts with murals and beautiful things usually last about 2 days. And after that, all the graffiti people go and do their tags and all of that on top of that.
Yeah.
So it's more about graffiti artists not wanting to be related to the more acceptable forms of.
Sure. Yeah. So, absolutely. And I think, these days, Banksy doesn't last long. It's either stolen or it's defaced. The popularity of a graffiti writer, no matter, how witty or interesting or whatever they may do, obviously has started to grate on some people. And, so that's an example, I think, that's really fascinating. But I'm sure that lots of people who, are doing these memorials probably don't want to be talked about in the context of vandalism either. So it's really, I'm trying to explain that it's this overarching term that we have, and it's very nuanced, and we apply it to so many things that are actually very different, and the behaviors are very different, and the intentions and so on. And over time, we see this changing as well. Now, the whole street art, mural, graffiti distinction is really, I think, reasonably recent, and that's partially, as I say, part of that desire for it to be commercialized, it to be, accepted into the art canon. There's all sorts of, reasons why those terms and those legal walls have been enabled. And yeah, I can completely understand that some people may not want to be associated with that. But at the same time, I think that there are people who have different modes of operating. Like, I'm an artist. I don't work only with my camera. I also do printmaking, so, and I might show some work and I might not show others, so there are different modes of operating within an individual as well. So, yeah, I don't know. Getting tired now. Thank you.